Welcome to another session of Learner's Mindset Discussion. I'm Dr. Dwayne Harapnik,
I'm Dr. Talissa Thibodeau.
and today we're taking a look at the idea of reading, reading books. How do you read a book? And going to primary sources. These
Pull
are,
out the ideas.
yeah, pull out the ideas. These should be things that we should almost take for granted, and yet what we're starting to see is that our students and a lot of our students in our educational system are a product of the recipe and regurgitation model or the information transfer model, where they very seldom get beyond having to sort of regurgitate facts, figures, dates. They often do not are not required or not asked to move beyond what Mortimer Adler would refer to in his book, How to Read a Book, move beyond the inspectional level of reading. So we're going to be talking about these ideas today, and how do we deal with this? How do we encourage our learners to move into that direction, and why? Why is that important? And just to frame the context here, this is probably one of my favorite old books. This was written in 1940. Mortimer Adler and his co-author is Charles Van Doren. 1940 when it was originally published. This version I have here was republished in 1972. And it's a classic. It's a classic guide to intelligent reading, which very few people are probably not even aware of. And one of the challenges with this How to Read a Book is that you have to actually move beyond the elementary and inspectional level of reading and move into the analytical level, as well as start to dabble with what Mortimer Adler refers to as the synoptical level, which is being able to read multiple sources and then sort of pull those ideas together, which is very, very challenging for a lot of people. That type of idea, pulling multiple sources together, is a literature review. Not a lot of people have an opportunity to do a literature review, but the literature review is really sort of the starting of that synoptical approach, but it's much more of an analytical approach where you actually take the ideas, you work with them, you move beyond the factual understanding to a deeper and fuller understanding. And so we're noticing, and the reason we're talking about this today is that a lot of our learners really haven't been prepared to read at this level or to work at this level. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think it takes some time to develop these skills. I think it's really important to consider what intrinsically motivates people, and whenever they're looking at new text for the first time, pointing out key ideas or helping them sort of frame what it is they're reading into something that they can apply and use. I think that's important. Sometimes I think we look at books, like you said, at the inspectional level, kind of glance through it, and hopefully something will catch our eye and we'll dig a little bit deeper. But how do we get our learners to go past that inspectional level is a really good question. And I agree. We've had this come up before, where, folks will sometimes maybe not read in depth into the text and hopefully, allow those ideas to simmer and process. So I think the question really is, how do we get our learners to get to that level? Because it does take a little bit of time to grow into that.
Yeah, it does. We also live in a state or a time when we can actually be quite efficient in the inspectional level. For example, you see I've got a lot of marks here, a lot of tabs, and so I was looking at this earlier on this morning, and I simply went on the internet and I went how to read a book, levels of reading, and boom, couple seconds later I had sort of a summary of the 4 different levels. And so it's easy for people like me to skip going back to the book to dig it out and to go on the internet and just sort of grab that tidbit of information. And I think there's a tendency for our learners to do that. Rather than read the book, you can actually find a summary, you can find some highlights, you can actually go on the net and pull those ideas out. And then because for the most part, especially in their undergraduate studies, a lot of students are simply asked to sort of identify that they could, what those ideas are. They don't have to do anything with them. So we often don't ask students to move beyond that inspectional level, what I call the regurgitation level, into that analytical level. And so when students move into graduate studies, or they're involved in a situation where they are required to use a book as a tool to, glean some ideas and to implement some strategies in their environment, they're just not accustomed to doing it. And so I think we have to help them and remind them that this is a struggle. This is a lot of work. In Adler and Van Doren spend an inordinate amount of time talking about the effort involved and the time that it takes, and they break it down into even more significant steps. This is a big, thick book, and most people aren't even going to read through this book, about how to read a book. And so, I think we have a challenge in the sense that a lot of our students come from an environment where they just have to give the facts back, right? And it's functioning at that elementary and inspectional level. And because of the internet, it's easy to find the facts, right? And if that's all that you're expected to do is simply regurgitate those facts, well, then you don't have to do anything with them. And then, well, you need a good rubric that tells you what facts you need to regurgitate. And then, that if you regurgitate, 9 out of the 10 facts, you're going to get an A, and then everybody's happy. But the reality is, and as Van Doren and Adler talk about, you don't really develop a level of understanding. You actually don't come to know, because if you don't work with the facts and make them your own, which is part of the analysis, you actually haven't learned anything. So we have a challenge that you can get by in our school system, our educational system, without having to learn things. That's a sobering thought.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely agree with you because I've been in the public schools to see this happening over and over. So, but we're missing an opportunity here. You and I talked about this last week, a conversation we had about how many times we've read a particular book. Okay, so Simon Sinek's Why. How many times I've read this book, how many different videos I've watched. Every single time I do, I pull something different from the video or the book. Then this opportunity comes where I start listening, looking at these ideas and going, what do other people have to say about that? What are other, New York Times bestseller, what are their opinions? What are other people and people that Sinek mentions in his book? I go down those rabbit trails and I'll look and I'll investigate and find out, how does this contribute to this bigger picture? And how can I actually apply this? If I take I was talking with my 5304 class last week, and I said, when you're reading these books, and we're reading The Influencer, I said, there's a few key pieces that are really going to resonate with you. Pull those nuggets with you and figure out how you can actually apply what you've been reading, what you've learned, and investigate it deeper. Learn it, allow it to simmer, allow it to go deeper, and look at other sources, see what they have to say about it. Essentially, that's really what you were talking about, a little bit of a literature review, and that gets to that analytical stage. So if we don't do those things, it could be missing that opportunity to really become an expert in what we're doing, or consider and look at others' advice about what they've had to share and experience with that idea. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. What you're really talking about is moving from that analytical state to the synoptical state in a certain sense, but you're also talking about going to primary sources.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got a post that I usually share with students in 5305 when they're working on their literature review, how I read an article or read a post online, and how the author was just dead wrong. They made typical mistakes you would make because they didn't go to primary sources. And I pointed out how when you go to the primary source, they were actually wrong. They read at a superficial level. They read somebody else who was also at the superficial level, and that person was also at the superficial level. This is how our internet myths, perpetuate. You've got all these, superficial level people who are just sort of repeating the ideas that are out there, and before you know it, you get this idea that everybody swallows 8 spiders a year, which is a myth. And
Yeah.
yet you just look around and it's everywhere,
So if
right?
everyone operates at the inspectional level, that's what we get: inspectional level regurgitation.
Yeah, and then you get things like the myth of the learning styles, right? Which
Yeah.
is one of the biggest myths we have in education, or the levels of understanding, cones of
Multiple
understanding.
intelligences,
Oh
maybe.
man, it goes on and on. There's so many myths that we have in education because we simply ask people, for the most part, to operate at that elementary level where they're recognizing the sentences and they're recognizing the terms. And on the when they move to the inspection level, all they need to do is regurgitate those facts. So
Mhm.
we have to encourage our readers, our learners, to move beyond that, and also warn them it takes work.
Mhm.
It
Yeah.
takes struggle. You and I were talking about this beforehand. We talked about an interpretation of an aspect of 5304, and upon a further reading or a further discussion, you recognize by just looking at it slightly different. Oh, this is what was meant, and
Yeah.
it's not until we actually take the time to revisit the ideas or to talk to somebody, right? If you think about, Mesereau's work and this notion of moving into that actually level of deeper understanding, or as Mesereau would argue, understanding period, until you talk about it or write about it, you really haven't moved into that level. And so we have to encourage our learners to do that, but we also have to remind them that this is not easy. And you had mentioned something in our conversation. Oh, yeah, that didn't work the way that I wanted it to. Guess what? That's the way it always works. And
Yep.
when we realize, shouldn't have done that. That didn't work the way I wanted it to. Well, guess what? You can never take that experience away. And when we make the adjustment, we then can realize, you know what? A lot of our learners might make that same misunderstanding at that point, and that helps us to point out, careful, careful. There's a path. There's a wrong path. There's a
Yeah.
fork coming up that you could go down, and when you go down that fork, it'll take you to a different aspect of understanding. And
Yep.
then it's a matter of working your way back to the proper path, and then going down that path that
That's
will help
learning.
you. Yeah, that's learning.
Yeah.
That's learning.
Yep.
And yet, um, I know you and I are often surprised by it, but that makes a lot of our learners uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Learning, which should be an uncomfortable endeavor. And by the time students get to grad school, they should be completely comfortable with the fact that, yeah, I'm gonna have to work at this, I'm gonna have to struggle a little bit. And yet it's not always the case. So I'm excited that we can actually expose our learners to that. But when I think of, you know, um, half to two-thirds of our learners are teachers in our
Mhm.
programs. I think it's important for us to recognize that by giving learners choice, ownership, and voice through those authentic learning opportunities, that our teachers are giving their learners the opportunity to find those resources, find those ideas, find those books, find those articles, find those blog posts, find those things that will help them to develop their level of understanding, and that they have to actually let go and give the learner control so that the learner actually develops that understanding, because it's that opportunity that you have to struggle with making those meaningful connections that is going to be the most rewarding. And the reality is that you just have to do that. There's
Yeah.
no easy road to that.
Yeah. It takes a little bit of time, a frame of mind, a little mindset shift, so change in focus. But I don't know that all of our folks or anyone out there has really truly experienced a learning environment the way that we have it set up here in the DLO program. And so this is also a way that they might struggle with the choice ownership input. I mean, really, I can make that. I mean, I can really make an impact on my organization, but just you know focusing and shifting my focus from here to here just a little bit. And I think that makes folks a little uncomfortable because maybe what we are asking and what we uh, want our learners to be able to do in the program is a little bit different than what they're faced with in their reality. So, in order to make that shift happen, they do have to go through that struggle. If they want to then set up those significant learning environments in their organizations, in their classrooms, and influence their people in an organizational setting, they have to experience that little bit of struggle themselves. I get it. And we had to, when we developed this program, we had to go through some of those growing pains too. But that's learning. That is learning, and we're experiencing it. They experience it. I tell the students in our program, when we're asking you to do something, we're living it too. We're going through it too, in some capacity, in some way. So understand that we're speaking from experience and helping you and coaching and guiding and facilitating and assisting on the side to let you be sort of the charge in your own, or the lead in your innovation strategy, your plans to make things different. So that's giving them an opportunity that might be just a bit uncomfortable. I've been there. I get it. I get it.
It is uncomfortable. I have the privilege of working with our graduate class, our synthesis class right now. And this week I've been looking at their reflections of their learning journey. And one of the things they're talking about is the fact that how uncomfortable they were in the initial stages. And initially they thought that this was a trick, that they had a choice to choose things. They could take ownership. And a couple of people actually said they thought initially it was a trick because it's never happened before. But once they recognize that they can take ownership of their learning, and then they realize the work that they're doing when they're developing a growth mindset plan, when they're developing their innovation plan, they're not submitting it to you or to
Right.
me, to the professor. It's for their students, it's for their learning environment. Once they recognize that what they're doing is going to have an impact on others, it changes everything. That aspect of ownership and that aspect of responsibility that they move into makes it much more significant. They recognize it's much more work, but they embrace the work because they start to see the differences that it's starting to make. And then
Mhm.
as students have been in the program for 18 months or 2 years, however long it takes, some of them have moved to different circumstances, and they're able to take these fundamental ideas and transfer them into the
Yeah.
new environments. They recognize that they can go to any school, any environment, they can be moved to any position, and these fundamental ideas about giving the learners choice, ownership, and voice through authentic learning are things that they can carry with them. And they also realize the struggle involved. And so
Mhm.
when they encourage their colleagues to move down this path, they're recognizing that there is going to be that struggle, and there is going to be that level of discomfort, and that the authentic learning opportunities are like authentically reading a book. You got to
Mhm.
dig in. You
Right.
have to actually struggle with the ideas. You have to not only, go to the dictionary to define your terms, but you might need to talk to other people about it. Whenever I'm reading something, I often talk to you about these ideas that I'm reading, or I talk to my wife, or I talk to colleagues. And it's not uncommon for me to have a group of people that I'll be talking to about the books that I'm reading.
Mhm.
And it's when you're able to summarize a chapter, an idea, and be able to sort of condense the essence of a book into a 2 or 3 minute discussion, then wow, I made the connections. And once
Right.
you hear yourself think, you might go, well, actually I didn't really understand that point that well. I need to go back and take a look at it. Right. So one of the things that I'm also seeing our students are recognizing in the capstone course is that in our discussion sessions in the DLL program, we allow students to actually discuss the work that they're supposed to do. None of this post once, respond twice recipe, which doesn't work. Because the discussions are a place where students come together, they throw these ideas out that they're struggling with in the books they're reading, the articles that they're reading, or the work that they're doing in implementing their innovation plans. And they talk about these ideas. They can hear themselves or read themselves, and they can see, I missed something. I need to adjust this. Or their colleagues jump in and say, hey, don't forget about this component. Don't forget about this issue. And so that act of sharing their ideas, collaborating, getting feedback on their ideas is so significant. And the exciting thing is when the students reflect on that and they see just how important it is to talk to their colleagues about that. Because guess what? That's the real world. We don't study in isolation. We don't actually work in isolation. We don't regurgitate information on an exam in the real world. No, we come together with people. We share ideas. We talk. We collaborate. So, and it starts with reading,
Mhm.
right? Something so fundamental, moving from that inspectional level of reading to that analytical level where you're struggling working with it, and then I think the most rewarding level is that synoptical level where you start to think, well, listen. Simon Sinek talks about the why, what, and the how, and that why really leads to understanding what your main result would be in the influencer model, right? And your 6 sources of influence might deal with the what and the how aspect. And then when you think about, well, you know what, that behavioral perspective of the influencer model is wonderful, but you also need some of a systemic approach and a logistical approach that comes from the 40X, recognizing that that whirlwind is going to be a challenge, and recognizing that, hey, you can do one thing at a time. So building a wildly important goal is extremely important because then you focus on that one thing and get it done. And then you recognize that to really fully implement that, well, you have to have really deep, heartfelt, meaningful conversations with people. So the Crucial Conversations book that we use in that particular course then fills in that other need. So that when you look at the 4 different ideas that come out of these different books or different resources, when you pull them together, then you recognize, well, this is how we actually can bring about change. That's that synoptical aspect of reading, and it's important for us to get our students to that level, but it's also important for us to remind them it isn't easy. It's going to be frustrating. It's going to be challenging. It can be intimidating at times, but once they go down that path and once they start making those meaningful connections, once you're able to do that with 1 or 2, significant things, then you start looking at the world in a different way. You start to see the nuanced ability to make those connections. And then the understanding of making those meaningful connections, the connecting the dots idea, I think makes much more significance.
Yeah, the only thing I think of when it comes to sort of wrapping up this conversation is collaborating is key in consulting resources as well. So you consult, you collaborate, you pull these things, ideas together and find the best way to use some of these ideas. And I think that's the key, one of the key takeaways here today. To get past that, maybe there's fear in a book. I don't know what there is, why we don't pick up books or, but dig into it, figure out how it can help you and take those nuggets and move forward. And I think that's important. I mean, that's what I do. So
Yeah, and you are right. There seems to be a fear in reading some books, but I can't remember who had mentioned this. Or where I had read it. I do read a lot. I do read a couple of books a week. But the time that I spent in this particular book, I've gotten to know Mortimer Adler and James Van Doren. I
mhm,
have.
mhm,
The insights that I've gleaned from this book represents the work that they've done. And I've met them. I've met them in the pages. Not
mhm,
only have I met them in the pages, but I've actually gone down part of their journey. They've
mhm,
shared their journey with me.
mhm,
And I'm a better person because of going down their journey. And that's their goal, right? Adler talks about the fact that reading at this level is a matter of pulling up your bootstraps. That's where this expression comes from as well. And it's that organic thing that we need to do. And you know what? Nobody else can do it for you.
right.
You
There are a
have
lot
to
of
do it
credits
yourself.
shared. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we should end on this note that I think we need to encourage our learners not to be afraid to meet some insightful minds in the
Mhm.
books that are out there, because I think that's what you're doing. And
Yeah.
if we can encourage people to recognize that, wow, listen, you're going to be exposed to some amazing ideas and some amazing insights. And if you take the time, you know, a lot of these people might be dead. You might not have the ability to actually go to dinner with them. And so reading their book is the next best thing. And so I think we've got to remind our learners to take the time to meet the great minds of our culture through the pages that are available to us. It goes back to the fact there's never been a better time to be a learner. Not only can we sort of move through the fundamental aspects of reading by using the internet wisely, by listening to podcasts, which I love to do, right? We can function at that inspectional elementary level. And then once we see something we want to glean and go deeper, we can move in analytically and use the resources that are available to us to do
Mhm.
that. And then we start to pull those pieces together, make those thoughts gel. Well, that's that synoptical level of reading that we want to work towards, and that can be the most rewarding. So once again, never been a better time to be a learner.
I agree.
Thanks. Just want to qualify something, and I've noticed this. This is I should have done this at the beginning. When I do the editing of these posts or these videos, I think, man, do I really sound that gruff and rough? Yeah, actually, I do. This isn't bad audio on my side. It's actually my voice. I had surgery several years ago. Had a sinus problem, and since that surgery, my gruff voice, which I had before the surgery, has become even gruffer. And boy, you should hear me when I have a cold. I sound even more raspier. So I apologize for that, and that's why I'm often drinking fluids to keep the vocal box working. So apologize for the audio. It's not a problem with the audio. It's just my voice. Thanks.